Well, hello there. Hi, Internet.
Hello.
I've got a special guest today, and you'll never know who it is because I haven't introduced them yet. But this is Docker Captain Nirmal Mehta from last week that I had on the show, and we thought we'd do it again. So welcome to the show. In case you haven't been here before, in case you're new, this is an hour or more that I do every week on Thursday now for almost 3 years. We're coming up, I think, on maybe 3 years. I have to look. We need to have like an anniversary party or something. You're invited back for that one.
Thank you.
Yeah, because you're trying to top the charts on the most frequented guest. So,
am I close?
I'm pretty sure you are number one, but I'll ask my lovely production manager to look at the stats.
Confirm the numbers. We need to do a confirm the numbers on that.
Oh wait, we don't track that. Okay, well, sorry. I'm gonna anoint you most frequented guest.
Thanks
Thanks for being here. Thanks for being here, Nirmal.
Thank you for having me. I'm Nirmal. I'm a Docker captain with Bret. I haven't left Bret's place since last week, so that's why I'm on the show again today.
Yes, we may look like we're in different places, but really we're not.
One day we'll do a show when we're together.
We did one at DockerCon together, didn't we? We were in the
in the hallway track. Didn't we?
We did. I think you were standing there, and we had someone else with us.
We had Niels DeMore.
Yeah,
DeMore. Yeah, from another Docker captain. That was fun. We had a chopstick mic. That was.
I still own that. I still have that chopstick.
Innovation.
Mic. Yeah,
innovative.
We had. I was gonna kickstart that. It was what it is. It's a lapel mic that instead of clipping on your shirt, if you just clip it on a chopstick or something, you can use it like a directional, like a reporter mic. And that's what I was doing because I didn't have a reporter mic. So it works great
because you're an innovative, smart individual, Bret.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right, everyone. Hello. Thanks for coming to the show. All right, so we don't have a topic today. Now, if you let us, we're just going to ramble, and Nirmal and I will just catch up on all things containers and tech. Mm-hmm. We were just talking about GitHub and code spaces right before this. So I encourage you to put your questions in the chat. Everything DevOps and containers specifically is encouraged.
Yeah. And while we've got a spot here, I just want to highlight that Bret runs off coffee, like the sip of coffee you just had. So I'd encourage everyone to become a patron of Bret so you can buy him a coffee so he can keep this going.
Why, thank you. Thanks for mentioning that.
And where can you do that, Bret?
You can do that at patreon.com/Bret Fisher. Link below. You can do this for free. All you got to do is go click the follow button, and you will get about a weekly email from me, just basically who's going to be live on the show, did I release any new open source, what new projects am I working on. For example, recently I just created a GitHub Actions example repository. So you can find all this stuff here. You can also buy me a coffee if you'd like to get some special benefits and get some exclusive stuff. We also have if you see up at the top here, DevOps fan. That's our Discord server where Nirmal and I hang out, as well as thousands of other people that sign up and then never say anything. But we have a couple hundred that are regulars, and I love the chat.
I was gonna say they don't. It's not like they don't say anything. There's like a ton of conversation that happens every day on there.
yeah, there is. But I do see the stats, and it's like, yeah, we have 100 people that chatted this week, which is enough.
It's above average for most communities.
It's enough. Yeah, it's not. I mean, if thousands of people were in there chatting, like the Kubernetes Slack, which I think is the largest Slack in the world, it would be a lot. We'd have to have hundreds of channels, or at least dozens, but we don't. We have a great little community, and it's amazing every day how I go in there and there's discussions in Docker, there's discussions in the Kubernetes channel. I'm learning stuff. They've got a couple of great people in there that are always sharing the latest stuff, so I don't have to go browse Twitter to find out what happened today. I can kind of figure out the major stuff. By the way, you mentioned the internet's down. So what?
Yes. Akamai seems to be having a problem right now, and a significant chunk of US websites, global websites, are down right now. So it's actually incredible that this is working right now, like our live stream, I think. But
we think it's working.
We think it's working. Maybe we're not talking to anyone right now. That being said, if there's one thing that I've heard you mention many, many times on many of your shows in the last, let's say, year, it's GitHub Actions. And this is unprompted, so Bret doesn't know that I was going to ask this. Can you show, and maybe this is not possible, but can you show what a GitHub action is for anyone that doesn't know what the hell you're talking about when you say GitHub action?
Yeah. It's funny you say that. So a GitHub action is a weird thing because it's a service that GitHub delivers, right? That has
Uh-huh.
many parts to it. It has workflows, it has jobs, it has steps.
Okay.
But then people create actions which are technically a step. So it's a little confusing. I can see why someone would be like, I don't know what an action is exactly. But if you go to something, so
Mind
if
you,
I
this
just
is
do
unprompted. So Brett's doing this on the fly right now.
Docker build. So
Uh-huh.
GitHub has a marketplace. So if you went to github.com/marketplace and then you clicked on actions, so they have apps, which they've had forever. You can
Right.
plug in your third-party tools into GitHub, and then they have
Mhm.
actions. So actions are a container that someone else can make, but you can make your own. You can make them private or you can make them public for everyone to share. And it's essentially it can do a lot or a little all in that one thing.
Okay.
So it's a program that you can create, or you can, you can just, it could be as simple as it automatically runs a node command, like node build or node test or something. And that could be an action. But you can have really fancy ones, like Docker has one to build an image. And the nice thing about all this is that they're very modular. So you can take them, if you find the 10 things you want to do and you can find an action for them, yeah, you can put them all in a YAML in an order. They go in order. As what they're called a step. So it's an action step. And so you could have one that says, build my image. You could have one that says, scan for security vulnerabilities. And each one of those actions, you would go pick a third-party tool's action, and you wouldn't have to write it yourself. So unlike most people CI, where they're probably doing a lot of shell scripting and command line, they're typing commands into their CI tooling, whether that's in YAML or in Groovy or something else.
Mm-hmm.
With actions, you're usually trying to find an existing official action from some company you want to use their product. You're plugging in your own YAML, and then it's maybe 10 lines of YAML, and you're just specifying usually like inputs and outputs. And so you're not writing shell scripts or shell commands. When you start doing that in actions, I start to get a little, my butt starts to itch because I'm like, hey, probably a better way to do that, because shell commands can change and syntax can change, and you don't always get the best error codes out of command lines. So instead of becoming a bash guru, GitHub Actions allows you to just take someone else's work, plug it in, copy paste, fill out a couple of values, and you're off and running.
Mm-hmm.
How's that for an elevator pitch?
That's awesome. And I mean, to me though, at the same time, there's with anything that's pre-packaged in this way, right? Like you're using third-party actions. That means that you're losing customization, but you're gaining composability. So
Right.
the trick is like you want the popular actions, I would imagine, are flexible enough to adapt to whatever that scenario is that it's being used for, but at the
Yeah.
same time is small enough that it's like a very nice, tight, composable unit that just does one atomic kind of thing, and it does it really, really well.
Right.
Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, absolutely. And the nice thing is, because all of these are open source, well, at least all the ones in the marketplace are, and there's
Mm-hmm.
tens of thousands of them now, I think. Oh, well, it has 9,298 results. But these are official actions, right? These are marketplace actions. Anyone can write an action, and you can make an action of any container. So a lot of people, you'll find that they don't actually go to the effort of putting it in the marketplace, but they might have a container that if you can run that as a container action, and the format's very similar. So it's as easy or almost as easy to run a container as it is to run someone else's action. And that's where it's very composable. So, and the other thing is, obviously it's open source, so you can always fork someone else's action and
Mm-hmm.
change it to what you want it to be. So if I did like a Docker, if I just search for Docker, and you always want to try to find ones that have the verified by GitHub. That you would find that for things like Docker and Trivy or Sneak or Circle CI or any companies that are officially making software usually want to find theirs. And you can see that Docker's already got 6 of their own.
Mm-hmm.
And so the most popular one is this one over here with 1.5 5,000 stars, which is build an image and push it. And it's pretty great. Largely maintained by Crazy Max, another Docker captain. May be on the show today. I'm not sure. Sometimes he shows up. But yeah, so the idea here is that your YAML just would, to build, instead of typing Docker build, it's really just this step. So each one of these steps is running an action. So see how it says uses? That's the action. So I'm choosing to run the Docker build push action. I'm specifying a
with
version
those variables.
Yeah. And then the rest of this wrapped around it is just sort of the formatting. Like I can name it whatever I want. I can have an ID for whatever I want to call it. And then I'm just saying if it builds, push it, and then call it this, tag it this name of image. And the rest of this stuff is extra. Like you might need to sign in to Docker Hub if you want to push the image. So you would do that, but that's a different action. So the line separates each one of these steps, and you would just put them in the order you want.
Got it.
So for a beginner, it's pretty quick to get started, right? You don't have to go learn a whole new language. You don't have to
set up Jenkins.
Yeah, you don't have to set up anything. Even free open source repos, get these by free, a certain number of minutes free, so you don't even have to pay for anything. All you have to do is have a free GitHub account. So that's why I keep saying this is the one to beat now. Like every other CI player now looks at this and says, okay, we have to be better than this, which is going to be pretty hard.
And you pay, so what? So you pay by the minute?
You pay by the minute of public runners, but you can self-host your own private runners. They give you the software. You can run it on any Linux machine or on a Mac or on a Windows machine. So a lot of times people will just install the runner on their local Mac if they want to like run a Mac job here, a Mac workflow, or they'll have a Linux VM on their Mac, and you just install the runner software, and then suddenly you can just tell this. There's a little line you would put up here that says instead of runs on Ubuntu, that means run the public one. That runs on free resources provided by GitHub, which run on Azure. But if you just change that to self-hosted, then it'll go look for any ones that you've added to your GitHub account.
Got it.
And then it'll run on those. And you can have labels here to specify, it has to be Mac or it has to be x86 or whatever. And so you would replace that. And that's what I'm doing right now is I'm playing around with the self-hosted stuff.
Very cool. Thank you for the rundown.
Yeah. And we talked about it a lot before, but of course we always have new people on the show. So if you're interested, you can actually go in my open source repos and...
I think you just passed it, right? GHA runners? Oh, no.
No, that is actually slightly. That's actually to create your own runners. So I have a little Terraform thing that I now just open sourced to basically install the runner for you using Terraform on an AWS auto scaling group. But if I just do GitHub, yeah. So this is the example that I was thinking of. And so I don't have the README walkthrough yet, but I do have an example workflow as well as linting. So it lints all your files to make sure they're in the best format with best practices. And then it will do a Docker build and push of your image using a lot of Docker's recommended best practices, basically. And it even pushes
this looks very similar to what we just looked up.
Yeah, I'm stealing their stuff. I'm stealing Crazy Max's ideas. And in this one, I actually pushed to Docker Hub and GitHub Container Registry, both. So you can actually do it all in one shot into two different registries. I'll share that link for everyone in case they're curious. All right, I know we've got tons of questions now, so I have no idea if they're related. So we're going to go top down, unless you see something you want to call out.
Oh no, go for it.
Peloton asks, future of Python. All right. I ask because AWS CDK is built on and pushing TypeScript, and with more developers moving towards either React or Vue with Node backend, making me wonder if this might be a shift. I don't know, man. I don't think anything can kill Python. What do you think, Normal?
No. Just one phrase: data science, right? Data
Right.
analytics, machine learning. I mean, that's like huge Python stuff. I would, uh, I would always. I'm one to never say that like one thing is dying versus something going up. If anything, there are more languages and more frameworks and more implementations of things coming out over time. And we tend to underestimate the size of IT personally. And once you actually start to realize how small of a sliver of IT, even me and you, Brett, like actually have visibility into, realize that everything is used all the time forever, essentially. You know, there's some COBOL somewhere back there, there's some Fortran, there's whole entire financial institutions that do nothing but OCaml,
Yep.
right? Like, I mean, everything's still out there, nothing really ever dies. Python, I can comfortably say will probably be in the top 10 for a very, very long time. If you want to count it in terms of like popularity and in terms of like usage. Yeah, very comfortable saying that. Now, that being all said, there is definitely a rise of the more statically compiled, statically linked, type safe languages like Rust are becoming more popular, and like things like that.
Yeah.
As we're seeing a lot of buffer overflow vulnerabilities and other security kind of vulnerabilities coming out
Yeah.
um, in the recent years. So those will probably start to rise up. But I mean, you're not going to get fired for picking Python or Java or something like that.
Yeah, and of course, it's always that. So we're looking right now while he's talking, and I agree with everything you're saying. We're looking at the Stack Overflow, which
Oh, there.
I think that honestly, I think it's the best thing on the internet for looking at this kind of thing, because whenever
Mm-hmm.
I look at other surveys, they're in a niche, and to me, Stack Overflow isn't a niche; it is the Google of code. So like
Yeah.
everyone uses it across all demographics,
So that's
and
an n of almost 58,000 responses, right?
exactly, yeah, and
Which
so you're
is statistically
huge.
significant.
Right, right. As opposed to 1,000 or 2,000 developers and some
Right.
and so a lot of vendors like to do those, but they're always like, the problem is, even GitHub isn't everything. There's trade magazines that do it. There's industry organizations like CNCF that do it, and the problem is those are all like I would call those very not biased as a negative thing, but like that's a subsection of the world's developers, and I feel like there's nothing bigger than Stack Overflow in terms of what all developers use. We all whether you're Vim or Emacs or VS Code or Mac or Windows or India
Yeah.
or US, like we all are using Stack
Mm-hmm.
Overflow. So anyway, at least for the English language, I'm not sure if do they have localization of Stack Overflow? I don't even actually know.
Probably.
I just don't see
Maybe.
it because it doesn't present it to me as a. I don't know if there's French Stack Overflow. But anyway, yeah. So the problem here is JavaScript is overloaded because JavaScript on the front end and JavaScript on the back end. Okay, yes, maybe that does happen sometimes especially if you're using Node.js, obviously. But
Mm-hmm.
JavaScript here is always going to be the number one language because it's used in so many different places. But Python, what's crazy is it's as the popularity of it compared to JavaScript, and it's only really a backend language. It doesn't run in the browser. It doesn't run natively on your iOS device. So the fact that it's that high and it doesn't run anywhere other than on a server or on your local machine in a
Mm-hmm.
Python client, to me, honestly means it's number one. Like, I think it's number one in terms of the popularity of server code, a number of programmers that are server focused, because any Python app's always going to have JavaScript on the front of it. So if it's a web app, so Python developers are still going to need to know JavaScript. So it's
Yeah.
funny you talk about future of Python. Unless you're specifically a backend only person, you're probably, if you're a Python web developer, and you're doing backend, unless you're lucky enough to be backend only, you're probably still gonna have to do some JavaScript.
And
Which
that's
means you
the other
kinda
thing.
gotta
I
know both.
mean, that's the other thing. Like most places aren't strictly one language
Yeah.
only.
We are getting more
And
polyglot, not less polyglot, right? Like the
correct.
industry is.
Correct. Yeah. So that's the answer to that. Now, if the question comes from, I'm a human, I have limited time and resources in my life, what should
Sure.
I spend my time on? Learning. Pick something from the top 10 list and just go from there. Like,
Yeah.
or if you have separate interests, right? Functional programming versus object oriented versus filling in gaps, right? Maybe you're used to C or C++ and you want to try something different. Like, that's up to you. But if you're new to all this, like, just pick one and move forward.
Yeah. What's crazy is just going. I mean, there's so many things we can talk about just on this chart alone. Because Ruby, look how little that is on that chart. And I meet Ruby people everywhere. I meet them in coffee shops. I see people, with Ruby stickers in coffee shops. Half of my friends seem like they develop Ruby. I don't know if that's my worldview or whatever. I get new clients all the time, and they're using Ruby. Like it just. But that's only 7% of the world. So in my worldview, if I were to make this chart, I would think Ruby would be top 5. But clearly, it's not. And so the point I guess I'm making is that if there's that many, if Ruby is that healthy and that active, and they're still releasing everything and still updating everything, fully supported, but it's only 7%, then what is really going on with the language at this level, right? Like there's no risk of that. Like in our lifetime, these will still be languages probably that everyone uses.
Yes. And the same as with Go. Like, so Bret and I, we're in the container world. And if you were just looking at like open source container stuff like Kubernetes and
Docker.
Container D, you'd think the whole entire world is just Go.
Right.
Golang.
It's so
correct.
In the cloud native world, it is actually weird to see a project that isn't Go. Out of the thousands of projects, it is actually weird to see that. And this is what you mentioned this earlier, and I wanted to bring this topic up because I want to come back to it. Let's talk about for a minute about how cloud native is shifting languages for teams because of the way the buffer part I didn't really consider even my top 2 of maybe those reasons, because there's
definitely other
tons
reasons.
of factors, right? One of them is programming in open source in a diverse team that's separated, right? So you could argue like what languages and the idiosyncrasies between languages are easier in massive GitHub open source repos, across every continent, right? So that's a factor. One of the other factors is the way in cloud native and DevOps and containers and this world that we're in now, the way we deploy apps and the statically compiled solutions that go in Rust and going back to C++, whatever, like anything statically compiled, the advantages those languages have in the ability to package, deploy, and update those with extreme simplicity. Like we're talking 10 lines of Dockerfile versus 200 for a typical Ruby app or a Java app. Like the ability for that to happen, like teams start to figure that out once they play around with these languages. And I see teams shift simply because they see these major advances. Whereas if you start going and looking at, should I statically compile, like just go down the internet rabbit hole of Googling statically compiled versus, dynamically linked or whatever.
Just in time.
Yeah. And you will see all these debates that go back decades and decades that have nothing to do with the reality of the modern cloud native microservice architecture, right? It's like people talking about, well, your binaries will be larger and, you want to really design it for the system you're on. And there's all these, when you start to read all of that, there's these assumptions built into that entire argument around, can you control your environment? Most of us don't do that anymore. We don't know what our host OS is. We're in a container. So you start to see like a lot of the reasons for not statically compiling all start to fall apart when you apply modern the modern reality of architecture and engineering teams. So I'd love to hear your take on that, because I haven't been talking to anyone about this, but that's kind of been my theory.
I think one other viewpoint on this, another twist to this, is as we're starting to go into DevOps and containerization and treating things more as ephemeral, cattle versus pets kind of attitude, determinism becomes much more valued. And that comes from, so if you want to make sure things are produced with a high amount of reliability and consistency, that starts to lend yourself toward languages that support statically linked, tighter packaged builds on top of the container aspects and security aspects that I briefly just mentioned. Like you said, it's a 10-line Docker file, right? You can run it in Scratch. You then start to go into territory where you can take advantage of much more tighter security policies. It's easier to scan. You're doing some more analysis on the code up front and making sure types are solid. I mean, you get all the benefits of statically linked and statically compiled languages, right? And the other part of this is because Kubernetes and the container world and the cloud native kind of move toward Golang, and it's probably going to also start going toward Rust and all these other things as well. That means that all the ecosystem tools will have to integrate at some point with Golang, right? So if you're building a CRD, or if you're integrating with creating a new policy for open policy agent, or you're doing anything to modify the infrastructure and to start modding and extending the cloud native infrastructure, you're going to have to write some Golang at some point outside of YAML configuration files, right? So it kind of self-perpetuates in that sense, but it's a very solid foundation. And it also gives an opportunity for a lot of people to try out that language, right? Like try statically compiled language. Because before this, and I'll speak for myself, most of the code that I was touching was Python, was PHP, some Java, not C, right? And now with Golang, you're kind of getting the benefits of the Python-esque kind of features and functionality in terms of ease of use, but you're also getting all the benefits of something like C, right? In that sense. And I'm not a hardcore developer, so I'm probably misspeaking a ton right now, and there's probably going to be some disagreements about what I'm saying, but just broadly speaking, that's the case, right? But yeah, this is a great topic, and I think that's also why Rust is it's starting to become looked at, and Swift, and the realizing that not everything has to be JavaScript, which is kind of on the other end of the spectrum, right? And then there's other things like security, performance, all that other stuff, right? Docker really solved the static binary having to compile for different targets, and kind of roughly solve that a little bit, and allows for more portability, even of statically compiled binaries. So, anywho, great topic.
I'm glad to hear some of your opinions on that, because look, I've been around long enough to see the evolution. There was a time where PHP was the bee's knees, right? It was absolutely the hottest thing on the internet. This was early 2000s, right? This is back when ASP Classic was a thing. Java was the promised land of the future, but it was still largely an enterprise thing, and it wasn't, I just remember everyone was excited about Java. We had JavaScript. JavaScript was probably, still number one at the time, but we didn't yet have Rails. We'd had Ruby at that time, around 2004 or whatever. We didn't have Ruby yet. Or I think maybe Ruby came, I think Rails was later, like 2006. I don't know. Anyway, so we had Ruby as a language. Go had not been created yet. I don't think Rust was even created yet. So when we look back at that, I watched the evolution of everyone loving PHP and then realizing that it was really written as a scripting language for the web that kind of morphed into being a more advanced language slowly over time. But it was really, at first, it was a pretty, like, it wasn't made by Google, right? Like, Go was created by some of the smartest people at Google to further the idea of a better language for network computing and
infrastructure.
Network-based computing, right? Mm-hmm. And PHP, I believe, it was like something homepage. I don't remember what PHP originally stood for or something. Anyway, so the point here is
PHP was invented for Nirmal in high school.
That's right.
So you can do some active, code.
So there was a time. Sorry, I totally interrupted you.
Make some dynamic web pages. Right?
Yeah, exactly. That's how I learned it, right? I was making web pages, then WordPress showed up. So in those early 2000s, Ruby came out, and then Rails came out, and it was like this really, Rails was like a mature way of consistently standardizing your implementation of the Ruby language, and it was on fire, right? So I saw everyone, in my worldview, shifting from PHP as a web language to, obviously a web backend language, but as a language for writing web-based applications, to Ruby and Rails specifically, right? And then 2009, 2010, I started to see all this shift from PHP or from that Rails stuff. I started seeing the early adopters shifting to Node.js, right? And loving the idea of, I want JavaScript. I already have JavaScript on the front end. I'm having to write two different languages for my PHP. I have to write two languages for my Ruby. And now I can write one language everywhere. And it turns out that Node was really, really fast. As a single process, single threaded thing, it was super fast. And I remember I was in a little startup with a friend of mine, and we were writing C# in 2010. So we were writing C# pretty early on in its days with .NET framework. And we were able to convert the entire application to JavaScript in Node.js at 40% the lines of code. So and that was largely due to NPM, right? Because NPM was one of the big things of Node. It was this amazing package manager that had every package to do all the things so that you didn't have to write them. You needed a time date stamp, like it would do that. You needed a fancy logging solution, it could do that. And you wouldn't have to write that code. Whereas in like the Java world and the C# world and the Visual Basic world, you had to buy something. You had to go buy some components and get an enterprise license to things that would be like that. So the reason I'm pointing this all out is I feel like that the entire ecosystem as a world goes through these shifts in languages, and the old languages never die. I have spoken at, what was the language written by Adobe back when it was Macromedia? Cold Fusion. There's still a Cold Fusion conference. There are still Cold Fusion teams selling software written in Cold Fusion.
There are still government contracts to work on Cold Fusion.
Yeah. And that is not in this list, right? This list we just saw, it's not in there. Pascal's not in there. Like, there's a lot of things that are used every day by teams that deserve conferences and have millions of dollars of revenue generated around them that are not in this list. So just because, like, I look at this, and just because Ruby is number 20 doesn't mean that Ruby doesn't have millions of people.
I want to do this. This will be a long-term project. I want to figure out what percentage is my own personal view of the IT industry. Like, first, figure out how big IT is, and then which probably is impossible, but to some order of magnitude. And then over a career, what percentage do you actually see? Right. And my hypothesis, and maybe this is already out there, but my hypothesis is, personally, I probably only see 0.1% or less of the whole entire IT ecosystem at any given moment in time.
Yeah.
And it's hard to understand how gigantic IT is.
Right. and how hard it is to not be not have a worldview that's biased based on who you know, right? It's
Right.
super hard to do that, and that's why I always love to come back to the Stack Overflow thing, because it's about as unbiased as of an opinion that I know of that exists in the
Right.
every one of my students is learning a language, and they think that's the language that everyone's using, right?
Right.
Regardless of what it is. And every one of my clients that is on a different language, they're almost all of them are all polyglot, right? They all have multiple languages. Some of them 3 or 4 languages at least, in a shop with only like 20 developers, and they have old Ruby apps. And the trend that I see, I don't know if you're seeing this, but it sounds like you probably agree with me based on your Go theories, your Go experience, and seeing that in Go. But what I'm seeing everyone doing is they had Ruby, they had PHP, they had Java, but none of their new stuff is written in that. They have those still today. Those apps will still exist for a very long time. But as they pull off chunks of those and they either microservice it or they create new layers on top of it, they're writing it in Go. They're writing it in Rust, and they're maybe writing it in Node.js. If they don't know any of those, they might still be doing Python. Like I see a lot of new Python projects, but the people that are like trying to be leading edge, I see them, like you were saying, I see all those new projects in Go and Rust all the time.
I see an intermediate step sometimes, which is they adapt to the latest framework in that language. So if they were Java, they'll go to like Spring Boot, and then they'll go to like a smaller version of Spring Boot that's easier to containerize or something like that.
Right.
And then they'll start chopping things off. But not, the world's not static. Like Java and PHP and all that. Like, I mean, Facebook comes out with new PHP stuff like all the time, right?
Right,
like,
right.
And so that means that like, what's nice about this is this friendly competition among all these languages and frameworks. It pushes and pulls all these other older languages to continuously innovate.
Yeah.
And some of them innovate even better than
the original. Yeah, they learn from the
premiere. Exactly. Yeah. Like, and you know, and the patterns change as well. Like you can still just be a completely Java shop, but you're now adapting to better frameworks that are more conducive to microservices or containerization or whatever thing that's, in vogue. Right. And, so nothing is static in that sense, right?
Yeah.
And it's just incredible. Like I always have to remind myself to take a step back and realize, like, even though like in our world, like we're doing Docker and Kubernetes and cloud native and all that, like that still represents not a majority of what is out there, right?
Like that's why it's
hard. It's hard to like understand that.
That's why it's hard when someone's like, because we all have to joke about Java, right? The conferences, it's always fun to say, Java like it's the old or bad thing. But the reality is it's huge. It's going to be huge for a long, long time, if not forever. Like, I don't think in my lifetime, there are hundreds of thousands of Java developers, I bet you, on the planet. And so really to a developer, it goes, there's like macro and micro, and it's like, at the macro level, you can choose whatever language you like the most, and you can probably find a job in that. At the micro, if you already have a job, you're stuck with the languages that they're already writing in, unless you have the authority to be able to say, "Hey, we need to start something new. We need to run this microservice. We got a new problem, and I want to use a new language that I want to play with." And you're able to introduce that and see if you get it caught on. That's kind of how new languages show up in teams. Is one person needs to write a simple little tool to solve a problem. They write it. It's not even supposed to be production. And then it ends up in production, because that's how all code works. If you write it, it will be production for someone someday. Kind of
like if you put something on the internet, it'll always be there forever. Right?
Yeah, there needs to be like a law written on my background. It's like, if you write it, it's production. Like if it exists, it is production for someone, like guaranteed. I learned that very early in my career, and it's not just for developers, for IT people as well. I create a little web dashboard from some tool that we don't have a business license for, and I put it on a server temporarily just so that I can look at something. Well, suddenly 10 other people are now depending on it, and now it's production for 10 people. And if it goes down, they're calling me, right? So that's production. So I think that the reality is with languages, there is no wrong language. It's just a question of, if I'm looking at my career, I'm thinking about, I want to be involved with not just languages, but projects that are on languages that are increasing in usage, not decreasing in usage. And that's the hard thing to figure out, is which languages are a percentage of all developers declining over time. Because then that means maybe in 10 or 20 years or whatever, that audience continues to shrink, let's say Code Fusion, for example. And so it's going to be harder for me to find those jobs. So I might not want to do that.
On the flip side, there is a lot of jobs just converting that stuff to something new.
That's right. You could be the
mainframe person that.
If you want to be.
Like there are still programming developer archaeologists needed. I would actually say a lot of our jobs are code base. It's archaeology, right? You're looking at old code bases. You're figuring out what decisions were made, how things work. You're figuring out how to improve certain aspects of it. You're doing the buy build kind of trade-off analysis, all that kind of stuff, right? So it's a lot more archaeology.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And Conrad's talking a lot about Rails and Ruby in chat. It's funny, you say GitHub is written in Rails. What's interesting is, what is GitHub now? I'm going to change the subject for a second. Like, GitHub isn't just a website, right? It's dozens of projects. It's local apps on your system. It's, for example, their runner,
enterprise appliance.
Their runner is a .NET app. It's a .NET core app. Is all their GitHub Action runners are all .NET. It's Microsoft, right? But it's .NET Core. Well, not Core anymore, right? .NET 5, whatever. If you run their app on your machine, I believe that's Electron. Like if you run GitHub Desktop, I believe that's Electron. So that's JavaScript. So you start to look at like, what is all the code inside of GitHub, the organization. And yes, when they started, it was just a website, and that was Rails. But I would be interested to see the stats of all code throughout their organization and what percentages are Rails now. My bet is it's a lot less than 100%. And it used to be 100%, but now these other languages are leaking in as they find a language specific to solve a specific problem that's better at that, I'm pretty sure they're not writing Rails for your iOS app, for example. I'm just going to guess, but I don't know. Maybe React Native.
Fascinating.
Anyway.
The world of languages is fascinating.
Yeah. So I say, I always feel like, you gotta write in the ones that you're hired to do, but pick a language that you just like. Like like I know way less in Python than I do in other languages, just because I've been able to largely avoid it in my career. And as a DevOps person, everyone says you need to know Python, but I find that if there's a problem, like the only reason I use Python is to edit someone else's Python. And so if there's a problem in DevOps and I need to write something, I'm usually trying to write it in Bash just because I don't want to create another repo with another thing that I have to compile in order to do this. So I'm like, I'm just going to do it in Bash.
There might be some universals there, right? So definitely understand shell. Shell script. You
can't avoid it. You can't avoid it.
There's definitely things that you can just not avoid, regardless of whatever programming language it is.
The great thing about learning the Bash scripting or
Linux
just shell
commands.
scripting, is that it makes you better at the command line just by learning the language, and you can't avoid the command line. So it's like I learn how to write complex commands, not by trying to figure them out at the command line at the time I try to run them. It's more like I'm studying shell scripts. I'm like, I didn't know I could do that in Bash. And then I try it at the command line and it works. I'm like, I'm going to do that from now on at the command line. Yeah. So I love it for that very reason, that it complements the rest of my activities on a daily basis. Great point.
All
Great
right.
point.
So
awesome discussion.
That was question number 1.
Right. I'm going to rapid fire. So Kevin says, Are there any pending issues bugging you with Compose v2? It continues to get closer to parity with Docker Compose, but curious if there are outstanding items that are bugging y'all specifically. No, as long as you're on the latest release with, well, actually, there's one bug I know of that I just ran into the other day. They're on beta 6, right? So we're still in beta for v2, but in beta 6, I have a bug where if you put a pound sign, no wait. Oh, a $sign in a comment, it crashes. It won't. Docker Compose will not work if your Compose file has a $sign in a comment, in a YAML comment. And I'm sure it'll be fixed by the next beta, but that's the only one I know of.
It's a regular expression somewhere.
Yep. Yeah. The team was, the Docker captains were working on that with the team internally to think about, because what actually happens is the YAML has to be parsed like 2 or 3 times. And in which parsing does this need to happen, right? Because it sounds like it's not happening soon enough or whatever. Yeah. So Kevin's asking about extends. I haven't used extends in forever, so I don't even know about extends compatibility.
Yeah. Apologies.
because V3 didn't have it. Yeah, V3 didn't have Compose format V3, not Compose V3. So confusing. Spec V3 didn't have extends. I just kind of trained myself not to use it. I don't know about you, but
same. Sorry.
Where the best place to get the DCA cert or any cert for Docker? The only one that I know of that has the word Docker in it is run by Mirantis, which is not Docker. They still offer the Docker DCA exam. I do not recommend it. I don't know of employers that are asking for it. The reason being is that certificate, sure, it does require some basic Docker knowledge and also Kubernetes knowledge, but it's largely on the Mirantis enterprise platform. So it's really a certification for their platform. If you're not running Mirantis in that company, then it may not be a valuable cert. I would always recommend getting a cloud cert, getting a Linux cert, and then if you're going to go Kubernetes focused, get a Kubernetes cert. Those are all like if you have an AWS cert, a company that runs Azure is going to can still consider that valuable because you know a cloud. You understand the concept of cloud. AWS even has a DevOps cert, I believe. So I don't know about you, Nirmal. What do you think?
Correct. Agreed. Concurred. The whole entire Docker certification is a bit of a boondoggle. And what you're saying is correct. I think there's another question about CKA versus CKAD. Yep. That's a better path to go down for sure. The certified Kubernetes administrator, and I think the next one is what's the AD again? CKAD. Let's see. Application developer. Yeah, application developer. Those are worth doing. I've former colleagues, friends who have those certifications. It definitely helps level set with respect to Kubernetes knowledge, which also will include some containerization knowledge inherently. And so So
a Kubernetes cert cannot hurt you. Now, everyone always asks, are they worth doing? That is only a question you can answer, because what job are you trying to get? Does that manager value certifications? I mean, I've worked for managers that value, a college degree more than certifications, and which I do not have. so I can't work for that manager. I never went to college. I went to the military. I got on the job training, not paid curriculum. So
the best kind of training. Get it done. It's going into production.
I don't know my history and I don't know how to spell, but I know how to configure the internet.
And by the fact that half the internet's down right now, you're above average.
Right. There are definitely a need for me. There's a need for me more than there are people that can spell without a spell checker. That's just my theory. apt-get, great question. Suppose you're part of a team, how important it is for everyone to have the same version of Docker, Ansible, and Jenkins? I have 2 answers, but I want you to take this one.
Yes, because you should be standardizing your team's development environments. And if you're not doing that, the drift will eventually bite you in the butt.
Yeah.
I would say major versions, 100% yes. Minor versions with respect to Docker, Ansible, and Jenkins, you can probably do a plus minus, 0.1 or 0.2 and be okay. But if someone on your team is taking advantage of a feature that's in the latest version of any of those tools, then you're going to have to be on the latest version. Now, what I'm trying to allude to is what's more important than being on the same version is having a standardized way for everyone to make sure that they are working in the same environment.
Yeah.
Back to you, Brett.
Yeah. So I was going to say, yeah, your answer is perfect. And versions are like performance in code. It doesn't matter until it matters. Versions don't matter until things break, right? So I've seen multiple ways of doing this. Well, super mature organizations, I've seen they actually create their own brew packages, and they help basically they give you tools to regulate their standard tooling versions on your machine, so that you move at the pace they move, and you don't have to worry about it, right? And I've seen people do this with brew packages where they make their own, which is fantastic. But that's a team that's they're skilled and they're advanced and they got time to do that. Like a lot of teams, especially if you're in a not so DevOps centric and you're not like SRE everything and cloud native, all that. Like if you're not on the tip of the spear, you're probably in a team that's in more reactionary mode. So you're only standardizing when things break, right? So and then you create a document that says everyone should be on Docker 20, whatever. And that's like the beginning phases. Another thing that I see that a great implementation by a friend of mine, John, where with every new repo, so if they're going to make a repo of Terraform stuff, they include a tool that will be built. So it's a bash script that runs a Docker command to put you into that tool in the version that they standardize on for use on your local system. And you're using it through a Docker container, but instead of typing in a long Docker command line, you're essentially just typing a little shell script that comes with that tool in that repo. So you're maybe just typing, docker.sh.
It's almost like a proxying commands.
Yeah. And then your Docker can be different, but when you're working on official Docker things with the company, you're inside this container that then it's probably bind mounting the Docker socket from your host, so you're controlling the Docker host. But it's a little bit, you get a little bit of a nested problem there sometimes, but it provides anyone, if they need to be or need to test on the standard official version, they can just jump into that with a shell real quick. So I've seen people do that in their tooling repos. There are other tools like Terraform where you can specify the version in the Terraform itself. So you can say, like, if you have Terraform in a repo, in the Terraform, I think it's versions.tf file, for Terraform specifically, you can say, you must have at least Terraform 1.0. And then that tool will solve its own problems, because if you try to run it and you've got an old version, it will just not run. So I would say if those tools have that, always do that, right? Always do that. Docker file, interestingly enough, Docker files, because Docker has been so hard at work on backwards compatibility, there's nothing like that for Docker. Yeah, no. There's no like minimum Docker version for a Docker file. There's no,
That day will come probably.
Yeah, but sure. they've worked really hard at backwards compatibility. But yeah, that day might have to come. We might have to put like a comment at the top that says, must have Docker 2 or whatever, Docker 3.0. Great questions.
Good question. Yeah.
Quick answer on this one, Alexandra. Self-hosted runners for GitHub Actions don't need to be exposed to the internet. No, they just need to have a gateway out. They long poll to GitHub, wait for jobs to be sent to them over an HTTP long poll. So they need nothing but an internet gateway, which is awesome, because that means you can put them anywhere on your own machine, in your closet, in a
Raspberry Pi,
in a non-public VPC that only has an internet gateway on AWS or something like that.
That old 2003 laptop in your closet.
That's what I really want. I want my test to run as slow as possible. So please Please give me a runner. I'll get that tag of slow so that it only runs the things that I want to run slow, like Doom. Like Doom
I wonder
1.
if is there a hosting provider that only hosts off of like used consumer electronics?
Only
Like
on
a
a
super cheap.
386 with the turbo button turned off.
I like it.
Yes.
I like it.
I've not heard of that, but you could do that. Let's see how much traction you get with that startup. Kevin asked, does a self-hosted agent runner for GitHub Actions reach up to GitHub and patiently wait for jobs? Yes. So that we just did that. Let's see. I recall Docker free account automated builds are going away on 26th July. Good to start getting around GitHub builds. Automated build setup easier, in my opinion. That's a great point. Hasnat? I'm sorry, I'm going to mispronounce your name for a minute. I'm trying. So that's a great point. And I forgot we haven't been mentioning that lately, that Docker for free accounts is no longer going to have auto builds due to, this is why we can't have nice things on the internet, Bitcoin miners.
Cryptocurrency.
Although I wonder if they've seen a decline since China's, have you heard about that? Like China went hardcore on.
So first of all, both Brett and I, we don't know. We don't have any of this information on like what we've been told that, in general, this is the same thing that GitHub faces, right? Like,
right. No, we know this because they put it in their blog post. They did say that.
Yes. Okay. Fair enough. But we can't speculate on whether it's a continued problem.
Who it is. Right.
Yeah.
We just know that there's people on the internet trying to misuse.
This is a problem amongst everything that provides a free way of running compute, right?
Yep.
Like it will be exploited. They're a for-profit company. They can't give out free resources forever.
Yeah. So really the questions around, it wasn't a question. It was a statement of GitHub using GitHub Actions for builds because Docker. And that's actually what I did with all of my own stuff. So if you just go to my GitHub account, /github.com/Bret Fisher, almost every repo you're going to find in there, including the examples, but also all my other stuff like shpod, which is a tool you use in my Kubernetes course, all of my examples from Docker Mastery, they're all now built using GitHub Actions if they have images. They're tested with linters using GitHub Actions. Like I'm now doing that across the board and no longer using any Docker builds. I pay for Docker Hub. I just find the concept of GitHub Actions exciting and I wanted to force myself to learn it. So I kind of did all this to, over the last year to force myself to learn it. But yeah, if you pay for Docker, you can still use Docker builds, but you can't do it with a free account as of next week, I think.
That's correct.
apt-get says, Brett, as a master of Node.js, okay, qualification, I am in no way a master of Node.js. I would never want to teach anyone JavaScript in Node.js. I can teach you how to use Docker properly in Node.js, but not Node.js itself. Is it secure enough to work with NPM? Because I read that there are so many vulnerabilities in those packages. Great discussion. I have so many thoughts. You go first.
I'm not a Node.js person either. So the main thing that I've seen with this NPM debate, or I guess, is it a real debate? Yes. Is regardless. So let me take a step back. Regardless if it's JavaScript or any other language, or you're just like scraping through Stack Overflow, don't just copy random snippets of code that you don't and just put it into your app and run it and build it without understanding what it's doing and what it's running. At this point in time, the friendly internet that we are all used to is gone in that sense.
Right.
You should get in the habit of not trusting inherently anything that you are copying or getting from the internet anywhere. that rule applies to npm packages. Now you might say, well, Nirmal, that means, I have to read these packages. I can't just like import a bunch of stuff and like trust that that library is doing what it's doing. Yes, that's what I'm saying. You can't.
Yep. Yep.
All the things that were theoretical have happened at some point in time. npm repos have been overtaken by people. They've been transferred ownership. Ownership has been stolen in the past. Signing keys or other things have been stolen or invalidated or not properly checked for revocation. Things have been manned in the middle, changed in flight. There was a whole entire thing with the Linux kernel, right? There was a research group from one university that submitted vulnerable patches to the Linux kernel maintainer group to test whether that they could do that thing.
Whether they could do that.
Pissing off like everyone
right
in that debate.
Right.
So
did you also hear about it was related was the test? I can't remember who did it. Someone tested npm package names for privates that weren't namespaced in the public, so they could overtake npm packages. And they did this with a bunch like Ruby, and basically found like all these packages used internally at places like Microsoft and Google were vulnerable to public namespace takeover. Well, it wasn't even takeover. It was this, they created a public namespace, the same name as an internal tool in a private repo, and the package managers are designed to look for it on the public first, and if not, back up and see if there's a private one. And basically got a bunch of source code to run in private secure companies simply by using public package managers in a very interesting and creative way that I like. Shame on all of us for having even package managers default to that kind of action, and two, that not being something that's a common security check inside of all of our security tools. I don't even know that I've ever seen a security check do that. Check to see, if I try to pull this package without your specific HTTP URL kind of thing, is it going to pull some other random package from the internet? And it does a lot of times.
So that being said, the truest answer to your question, is it secure enough to work with npm? Bret and I are not qualified to answer that because we're not security researchers that have scanned every single npm import that you might potentially import,
right.
And can't tell you that.
You are responsible for every piece of code all the way down to the kernel. And this is an interesting conversation that I had just yesterday, which is one of the best things I think that Docker ever did is it shifted left. It pushed the concerns of every single dependency all the way up to kernel into the developer's responsibility. Because now, what I was hearing this is from the DevOps High Fivers group, which is over on Patreon, right over here, shameless plug. Our Patreon group, if you pay for the High Fivers group, you get access to a monthly call, which is just a bunch of people working in code and DevOps hanging out every month, just having a coffee chat. And we were talking about someone's experience with the challenge of their group. Their developers were wrongly sold on the idea that once things are in containers, I don't have to worry about OS anymore, so that when something like the OS's apt package for OpenSSL gets updated, I don't have to redeploy my code. They thought this was true. It's not true, because now if you have to patch some specific OpenSSL version and you depend on that, and it's an OS install dependency, in other words, an apt package, you have to update that package, and that's in your Docker file, right? So what's interesting about what for 20, 30 years, if it was installed by the OS package manager, often developers didn't concern themselves. They threw it over the fence to ops, and now ops had to deal with that problem. Well, what Docker did was say, actually, no, we're going to provide you a kernel, and that's it. Like, you need anything, a kernel and resources, right? So the network's going to work. You don't have to worry about drivers. But other than that, you need to put everything in your Docker file. And if a developer becomes the person to write the Docker file, they now have to list every apt dependency, every npm dependency, every webpack dependency, all these things, because I work with apps that have like 5 different package managers. So, and what I love about that is that developers look at that and they're like, man, I got a lot of dependencies. That sucks. And then they go look at something like Go, where everything is bundled in. There is no OS package dependency, right? They're not having to use 5 package managers. It's really just mostly the Go package manager. You might be doing it wrong if you're using other ones. But anyway, so I think that it really focused the developer on having to realize, I have designed an extremely complex, fragile system for my web app when I have to consider all of the additional dependencies. And PHP's known for this. Ruby's known for this. Like, these are some of the worst. PHP and Ruby are some of the worst offenders. Well, Node.js normally is just NPM, right? Like, if you're a Node person, you can get away with just NPM usually. If you're doing app dependencies, you might be messing up. But the problem with a lot of PHP and Ruby developers is they don't realize until they get to Docker, like, they had all these crazy dependencies. Like, their drivers would be an apt install, and their web servers would be an apt install. So what I love, and it was a conversation we had yesterday, was in that High Fivers chat, was your developers are now responsible for the ROS dependencies, and they don't like it. Like, they're complaining because they're like, I don't want to have to worry about OpenSSL. Well, you need it because your app is designed for it. So you are now responsible for all your dependencies.
And one thing that I'm seeing, that I saw a lot of enterprise customers that I was supporting in my previous job, was a move away from being able to even import public libraries. Like, there is a transition happening to, and I'm pretty sure this is true in a lot of corporate environments, but maybe not, where you can only import from your own internal, vetted, approved artifact library, right? Like your artifact registry. And, there was a process, enterprises are creating processes to vet libraries, dependencies, everything like that. It goes through that vetting process, then it gets uploaded into the central internal repository, and then your whole entire infrastructure is locked down to only pull, like, Docker files can only pull from your internal repository, and then the image itself is only uploaded into an internal repository, and your infrastructure can only pull from the internal registry. Container images, and then you start to, then you use tools like the container security tools and dependency security tools to do that scanning up front in your CI/CD pipeline, and you have a separate team that's using those tools to do hardcore scanning of libraries and whatnot, right? The nice benefit is the pendulum is swung. Like, we used to just be able to get away with importing, .star or whatever, like the joke is, right? It's import star. Now, like, the pendulum is swinging way back, where it's like, oh, we never even, especially when the OpenSSL, I think, to me, it really shifted when there was that OpenSSL vulnerability. When was that? Like, I want to say like 5-6 years ago now, right? It was at Heartbleed. I forgot the names. They all have good branding now.
I think it's Heartbleed.
But when Heartbleed came out, and everyone realized that, first of all, it was like one person maintaining, like, OpenSSL, like, unpaid, and, like, this massive vulnerability, and no one knew where it was in their stuff. Like, focus on dependency and understanding one's application dependencies was huge. And then, of course, Docker helps with that, because you're explicitly, like Bret's saying, you're explicitly saying what your dependencies are, which is a good thing.
And that's, I love this focus. I mean, it's more work, right? This is all way more work than we want. And so we had these, like, a decade ago, when Rails was in, I'm gonna say it was peaking, but who knows? It might be more popular today. But, like, Rails hype was peaking. I mean, we had all these gems, wonderful gem tools. NPM was out and new, and just people were making JavaScript libraries like nobody's business. And this was all magic days, and there was no downside. Like, we were using everything everywhere. Like, if I could find something, I don't even know who made it. Like, doesn't care. Throw it in the app, right? And then, in this last 5 years, I think we've really started. Once the entire internet was built upon these ideas, we've started to see all these cracks in the foundation of, oh, you mean I can't just take code from random people on the internet. So the long answer to my long answer to this question that we've been going on for 10 minutes, which is another great discussion, is if not npm, what? Tell me a dependency manager that is secure. None of them. The one doesn't exist. You look at apt. You look at any dependency manager, and it's pulling in anything anyone can put on the internet, and those things aren't secure. Those things aren't patched. I mean, you take an Ubuntu or a Debian system and install it fresh, update it, and then scan it for vulnerabilities. There's still going to be vulnerabilities there, almost certainly. So,
right.
It's just you can't. None of this is safe. So you have to assume it's all unsafe, which means npm is fine if you assume it's unsafe, and you have to look at every single dependency and accept the risk that it's going to, But like you said, I also agree. I'm seeing my clients shift everything internally. It doesn't mean they're writing all this source code. It means they're taking that module, they're vetting it. It goes through a process. Yeah. It gets copied or forked or cloned or whatever you want to do into their private place, and then they own that copy. And they probably don't change it, but they know that it's not going to change. It can't get taken over there as easy as like something on the internet. They don't have to worry that tomorrow it's going to pull a different version because someone hacked it. As much. I mean, technically you could always hack internal resources, but the idea is, you're right. Like, I see that too. They're moving in everything internal. Yeah. We don't have great tooling for doing that, though. That's one of the things I noticed.
That's an area of exploration, and I think that's continuing to evolve. Now, there's always an engineering trade-off, right? That means that your internal IT team needs to keep that up, right?
Yeah.
Like, needs to have availability. Yeah. But on the flip side, like today, when like half the internet goes down, you're not reliant on, a bunch of random internet repositories for your builds.
True.
You can just, you're baking local caches essentially of the stuff that you need.
Although it doesn't have to be Artifactory, right? Like we're talking about like very large enterprises.
It's more than one, right? You have like the container registry, you have like Artifact, you have library, like it's the caches for like whatever your programming language package manager is, like whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
But I agree, there's no like universal registry.
Right.
Open source artifact registry.
Yeah, you could still store all this stuff as open source in GitHub or in private source as GitHub. Like, you could still put on this thing. It's not like you have to go buy something or do something internal. Because I have companies that they fork everything and they use all their own versions, but it's all still in GitHub. And they can use the Ruby package manager in GitHub. They can use the npm package manager in GitHub. Like, I'm going to put my GitHub
thing.
I'm gonna put my So if you're put my GitHub fanboy hat on, but like, you don't have to buy Artifactory or spend $100,000 to privatize your dependencies so that you can ensure or have an audit trail that's a little bit more controlled than the random internet audit trail.
Yes.
But yeah, I definitely see that trend. I just wish the tooling was better for doing that switch. Like, wouldn't it be great to have an npm command that says make repos for all this stuff and put it all in my own thing?
I think it's not a first class citizen to switch that in a lot of languages and package managers, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Anywho, that was
another
awesome.
Great one. Conrad has another question about how to switch the channel on Docker Desktop. In the settings somewhere, there's a link that says switch to the beta, but I don't think they even do that anymore. I think what it is there's a button in there that says, do you want beta features? And it's like a checkbox to say experimental
features.
Yeah. So that's all there is now. There's no
more
edge
like
channel.
edge. There's no more edge channel. Yep.
Chris asked, which Linux certification would you say is valuable? Any of them is my opinion. I mean,
the official Nirmal Mehta Bret Fisher Linux certification 2021. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah. I would say anything, because if you get one, like, I mean, I've not met an employee, not that I'm saying they don't exist, but I'm not met an employee that's like, well, you got the CompTIA Linux, so I'm not, what do we really prefer is a Linux Foundation Linux or whatever. Yeah. And no one just has one certification, right? Like, you don't just have one certification. You start with one. You work your way up over your whole career. So,
and it's basically whatever is required by your regulations and compliance frameworks that you're working under, and then anything else, right?
Yeah. Yeah. If you're working for a good shop, if you're going for a job and it's a good hiring manager, and it's always hard to tell, right? It's hard to tell who people are until you really are in the thick of it with them. But a good hiring manager, to my definition of a good one, is they will look at your track record of learning, not at how many you have. Because if you're in your first 5 years, like how many certifications could you possibly have in your first 5 years? And if you had a bunch, I would argue that you're really great at book studying and you're really great at test taking, but it doesn't mean you know anything about that stuff. So to me, it's about your track record of how do you learn, how do you evolve, show me your open source, show me your GitHub repos, your public ones, not your private personal company stuff. But like, show me how you've evolved your learning, because if you're in IT today, every year you're learning new stuff, every month and week and day you're learning new stuff. So it's, to me, more about how you do that, rather than I learned Ruby 3 years ago, I got a Ruby cert and I haven't done anything since. Like that to me is a red flag versus, well, last year I did, my theme was this, and the year before my theme was this, and maybe I did a Linux one every 2 years I get a cert or whatever. Like whatever your methodology is, as long as you're showing a track record of continual learning, I think good hiring managers recognize that way more than they would recognize you have 30 certs but only 2 years experience.
Yep. Continuous learning.
Yeah. Kevin
asks, we should do a career show, Brett. Okay.
We should do that. A lot of people ask all the time about career stuff. And I had someone on earlier this year. I had Nana from Tech World, or Nana's Tech World. She was on at the beginning of the year, and we talked about it.
Awesome.
Anyway, Kevin asks, are build logs from a self-hosted GitHub runner available to be reviewed from GitHub? Yes. They're in the run. You see them, and they're stored by default for 30 days.
Magic.
Yep.
It's freaking magic.
Everything that's coming as STD out, standard error, they're all shipped to GitHub and stored. Yeah. What are your thoughts on Nix package manager? Never used it.
Ditto.
Sorry, Bob.
It's probably awesome.
Yeah. Tell us what you think. Put it in chat.
Harbor. Yeah. So Harbor is a registry, an artifact registry. Awesome choice.
Oh yeah.
But enterprises differ, right? With respect to features and functionality that they want.
Right. I mean, Harbor's nice. It's got a lot of the things that I like. It can lock tags so you can't replace them. It can auto scan images with CV scanners. The project, like some of the design of it's a little wonky, but if you're used to some of the traditional, but it, I guess the job done. It's just, to me, I never want to have to run a registry. It's just, I want someone else to do that. I'd rather the internet do it, but if you have to have an internal one or a private one, ideally you can find a team that would do that for you in a redundant, highly available and highly tested restored way, because setting up one isn't enough, and setting up a simple store that is going to grow to terabytes very quickly isn't fun either. So unless you're that kind of person where you love infrastructure and you just want to do the plumbing, if you're a plumbing person, go forth. Plumb away.
Plumbers unite.
Plumbers unite. We need plumbers. They're the most critical, one of the most critical jobs in our city's infrastructure. Is anyone still using PL/I? I have no idea what that is. Biker's trying to show how I am not as old school as I think I am, I think.
Let's see, how old is that language? 1964.
I used Alps on Bendix G15 and Fort. Yeah.
So I see that on Wikipedia that there was a Linux library for PLI that was introduced in 2007. So it's probably going strong somewhere.
Yeah. Is that a language or is it a hardware platform?
It's a language. Programming language 1. Great name.
It's the first. Yeah. Other than the abacus.
Yes.
Yeah, and what's fun is to see people that like love this stuff, like love these old languages, love these old platforms. Then you'll see like QEMU emulate some crazy old processor platform on Linux, and someone has a compiler for that language that will work on a modern x86 platform. I mean, that stuff's cool. I don't have any time to play with that stuff, but it's neat. And you know, then I'm sure it can run in Docker. It always surprises me how many different platforms Docker supports out of the box. Like how many Docker. And then this is, by the way, all in Golang, which means that Golang is supporting all these different platforms, which I think is also an indicator of long-term health. Like,
correct.
If you've ever tried to get some of these other languages like Ruby or like Java, try to get Java running on a 32-bit ARM device, can be problematic.
Have fun.
I can't get Maven to work on it, so I can't even do a Maven install. So I can't do it. Like I have course examples in Java that I can't support on Raspberry Pi with Java because I can't find a way to easily support without basically building all this stuff from source myself. And I really don't want to have to build my own Maven for students. So that's when I start to look at all these modern languages like Go and Rust, and like they're creating single binaries that are much bigger than they need to be, but they're extremely portable. And that in the modern world, portability of code is probably one of the most important factors, because what we're seeing today, for example, is ARM is starting to break into the cracks of Intel's stranglehold on computing, and so you can't just assume anymore that the future of your code is only on one platform architecture.
It's only x86. Yeah.
Yeah, which we've had for 25 years as a luxury. We're like, it's only going to be on an x86. So, and then remember the whole x64 conversion problem? Like for a decade, it was kind of a pain. And now everything's compatible and it's fine. But we're going to go through that same pain point again once everybody realizes how much cheaper it is to run ARM, and money matters. So you're in 5 years, I can imagine anybody's code on this, listening to this podcast, this podcast or this YouTube live stream, you're probably going to have to deal with ARM in the next 5 years, or in the next year if you're running an Apple laptop, and that means you have to cross compile, which means your app may not even be able to do that very easily, and that's largely due to your language and your language's compiler. So when you look at these new languages, they're solving these problems ahead of time, like they're compiling to a single binary for easy distribution, easy downloading and copying. Containerization. Yeah, running on a platform with an easy curl command to download instead of needing 20 different library files and 5 different subdependencies. And with the statically compiled languages, you don't have to worry about that. And yeah, sure, it's more storage, but storage isn't our problem nowadays. Storage, not that it's a solved problem, but most of us can solve a storage problem with a little bit of money. Whereas we're not making more developers as fast as we need them. So we need rapid development, rapid deployment. And so it's funny that we're solving different problems and making other problems harder.
Yep.
But that's because we're addressing problems of the day. And
it's always a trade-off. There's always trade-offs.
Yeah. And the problems of today are we need more developers, and how do we increase velocity with fewer people? That's where Docker came from. That's where Kubernetes came from. We need to do more with fewer people. And I think that's that's why you see these languages shifting to the stuff like this. So anyway, Conrad says he just got his MacBook Air. So M1, nice. Baby. When are you getting your M1?
My personal M1?
Sure. Or
M1. We were talking, me and you were talking before the show. I'm highly considering getting a Mac Mini like you have, Brett, M1 Mac Mini, but then waiting for the next chip, the M1 something, M2 right. M1 something, X whatever.
M2.
And getting a laptop based off of that, which I think makes sense. But if there's do you think a new Mac Mini, Mike? Oh, are we going to turn this into an Apple forecasting YouTube live session?
We're wrapping it up, so you and I can talk about whatever we want.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah.
We can squander another lovely hour talking about like trying to
We
predict
could.
the next
So-
thing in the Apple world.
So in the podcast translation of this episode, we will turn this into the bonus round, and
Yes.
people can then know, oh, they're done with those topics. Now they're going to talk about their own personal laptops. Do you think? I think what?
Let me put it this way. I cannot wait to have an M1 based or an MX based device in my household,
right?
So that I can play around with it, because I feel like I'm missing out on all the coolness that everyone's been talking about. Yeah.
I think this transition is going to happen very slowly in some ways, but also very quickly in others, especially for people on Macs who tend to buy, if you're a professional developer, you might get a laptop for every 3 years with your company, which means you have about, if you're on Apple, if you're going to have a Mac, if you have a Mac now, you're less than 3 years away from having an M1 as your only option. In a year, we will not have any more Intels, and so your company will either have to buy old laptops as new,
or get rid of Mac,
and go Windows only, or adapt to M1 and ARM architecture, which I think is much more likely, because it's hard to imagine developers sticking around when the company forces them to shift platform.
And I think also like the transition. So what Bret was alluding to is a lot of the cloud providers are now making native ARM-based compute available, and their own ARM-based compute chipsets themselves, right? Like their own compute that's customized, that is optimized for their cloud environment. And they are charging significantly less money for that compute. And so it's not only the developer laptop M1 chip that's pushing toward ARM, but the infrastructure workload. And if M1 pushes the synergy to be able to develop for ARM more natively, then there's going to be a convincing of your business leadership to reduce costs by transferring your compute to ARM-based nodes. And I think that's like the thing that's going to happen over the next 10 years for sure.
That's why I feel like at the end of the 2020s, the end of this decade, we're gonna look at ourselves and realize as developers, we've got ARM servers, ARM laptops, and even if you're on Windows, you're going to be running Windows on an ARM laptop, ARM on your servers. Amazon already has Graviton version 2, so they're already on their second gen, which are indeed faster than the first, very much faster, and they're claiming 40% cost savings, or is it 60% savings? And we're seeing like Oracle already has on their Oracle platform or whatever, they have ARM instances. So I think, Microsoft will be next. I think eventually DigitalOcean and the smaller players like Linode, they'll all have to get in that game. They may not do their own custom chips, but they might buy, what's Server Pro or Server Micro or Serve Micro is you see those in a
Super Micro.
Thank you. Yeah, where they do the custom build servers for smaller companies. We got Oxide, which you know about Oxide, right? Yeah,
I do know about Oxide.
Which we could do a whole episode on that. I'd love to have them on the show because we don't normally talk hardware on this show, but that would be awesome.
So a career show and a hardware show, for sure. We need
but specifically a server hardware show, because we can talk about Raspberry Pis and Apple M1s, but no one's really talking about server hardware like Oxide does.
Who knew that my Raspberry Pi 1 was ahead of the curve, ahead of the trend?
Well, what's funny is that they've claimed that they're only focusing on x86 because they don't believe ARM has a stake in the data center, but that was like a year ago, and I'm thinking they might have to change their stance because they're putting so much effort into this custom, all the custom not BIOS but EPROMs or whatever what's the new one?
I know what you mean.
Yeah, so they're doing everything custom. In fact, if y'all don't know what I'm talking about, go over to
This is like the 16th pivot of this show today.
Yes. So some of the smartest, most respected people, at least that I respect in the computing landscape, two of my favorite people especially are people that are starting this startup, which has been around for a couple of years in sort of secret mode or stealth mode. And starting next year, and I think they had it originally, it was 2021, but I'm guessing that, pandemic played a little part. They're coming out with basically, if you're doing your own data centers, this is now like the next gen Dell and HP server. Like, they're not just saying we make an Intel server. They completely did everything from the ground up. Like the way you remote into it, the BIOS. I'm just not BIOS. What's the other thing? Somebody help me. What's not? What is the BIOS? Is the old school thing. It's the new one. All that stuff. It's basically
UEFI.
Yes, sure, that thing. They're basically from the ground up building this thing, focusing on Linux, all custom hardware, reinventing everything that needs to be reinvented. And they have a great podcast called On the Metal. So if you love hardware, go check out On the Metal on their website.
2048 x86 cores, up to 32 terabytes of DRAM.
Right?
1 petabyte of raw NVMe storage. 100 gigabits per second network. Brett, do you want to sponsor one of these for me, for my household?
Yes, cool, as long as you sponsor mine. So these are the, stop it. Protocol. Come on. No. Go away. Please let me. Okay. These three right here. I only know 2 of these people. I don't know them personally. I haven't met any of them in the real world. But so this person on the right, Jessie Frizzell, is like of Docker fame. You all have used her code. It's baked into Docker, still there today. She was one of the original engineers at Docker. I think one of the things that I loved is she created some of the default security profiles for seccomp and a lot of the other things that are still built into Docker and making Docker secure your code better than default. This is Brian Cantrill in the middle. I'm going to make sure I got his last name correctly. Brian has some of the best talks on the internet about the history of computing. He nerds out like a proper nerd should. And used to work at Joyent, and I was a big fan of Joyent. And when they were trying hard to do Linux on Solaris, and they were doing some really cool stuff there. I had a couple of clients actually that were using them for their compute instead of AWS, and because it was faster than AWS because they did bare metal. Anyway, he's super smart, super nerdy. Just go look up his name on YouTube and you'll find tons of talks about the history of computing and how we got to the mess we are in. One of the quotes I use from him a lot is how if you took the original founders of like the mainframe and the original OS and they went and they saw the way we do use virtual machines today, they like would roll over. If they're dead, they would roll over in their graves because the idea that we virtualize the hardware platform so that we can get more out of our hardware by abstracting a fake OS is just insanity, and that we should really be trying to get back to native host level platforms, which is one of the things that containers can do for you. So he's got a great speech on that. I go check that out. I don't know this other guy. Anyway,
I'm super
big
looking
fan.
forward to seeing what they're going to be doing.
Yeah. I totally hope they have like developer editions that allow us all to have like an affordable platform that's like maybe 1,000 or less that you can kind of like run at home.
Business opportunity there.
Right. Because you know that this thing is going to be smoking fast and like be like it's probably not going to run like a jet engine because it's probably going to be super optimized, because one of their focuses is on getting the most out of your hardware as well as being very thermal efficient. And, heat is one of the biggest problems in a data center. And so instead of us just having the insanity of Intel, I do believe they're running Intel chips. I don't actually know, but I just know they're going to be
AMD.
Intel. Oh, they're running AMD? Okay.
In Milan. Yeah, that's what's listed.
Anyway.
You should aim to get Jesse on your show.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, the problem is my show is called
we'll do
Docker.
A campaign.
And I don't want to talk about Docker. I don't. I want to talk about hardware. So I'll have to sell her on Twitter or whatever.
Show.
Yeah, we're going to talk about hardware for DevOps.
To be fair, though, one of the things that it looks like they're focused on is on ramping from turning on that hardware to deploying apps. With the knowledge that this team is bringing, it seems like they're not just like providing the hardware, but like they're bootstrapping the whole entire stack optimized for modern application deployment right off the box. And I have a feeling that that's where a lot of the magic is going to really occur.
Yeah, because if you've ever tried to take like Dell or HP computers and put them and automate them from bare metal with nothing on hard drives, it is it feels very cobbled together, right? Because it's still based on a platform that's 40 plus years old and still trying to be backwards compatible with everything while also offering all this new stuff. And you should see some of their talks because they talk a lot. They've been talking a lot for a year about these are the problems we're trying to solve, and they're the kind of problems that we don't even realize we had because we're so used to the pain of bare metal. If you've ever worked in a data center and dealt with the bare metal, it is so painful. And even just getting it to boot to USB or whatever, and even having USB, which is dumb. It's just there's a lot of concepts that they really do some deep thinking on that, and plus their website is just cool looking, like.
It's awesome.
And
they have a podcast.
Yeah.
So they have an On the Metal podcast. You should all check it out.
Did you notice, by the way, the 0x? Like there's all this play into even the name itself and the hexadecimal and yeah. Anyway, I dig
Can't
it
wait
all.
to get our shirts for pimping this.
Yeah. Sign me up for the fan club. They haven't even launched yet and I'm ready for it. Yeah, I basically need their designers to supposedly they got one branding company because the branding company talks about this. They got one branding company to do everything. So it's like the website, their UI for their actual software, their physical interface, like everything is all themed the same way. So expect an extremely consistent brand throughout the whole, which reminds me of Apple, right? Like the hardware and the software are designed together in the same theme, so everything will look similar and feel similar. Plus, it looks like the Matrix. Like this is like if this is like a Matrix data center. So, all right, yes, UEFI. Thank you all. I know he said it, and I don't know how you say that as a word. I only know how to spell it out. That's what we're talking about.
UEFI.
UFI. But yeah, I kind of want this as my background on my computer. I just want it to move all day like this, like it's moving the bits and things are happening on the internet. So each one of those is a core. I'm just now realizing because you said it was 200 or whatever cores. Like those are all cores in one system. All right, people.
And you know their user interface is going to be this badass TUI.
Yeah. It better be a TUI. I will accept no less.
All right. Well, we've squandered a great hour and 45 minutes, Brett. Covered a lot of ground today. Any parting thoughts, Brett? You should probably ask me that, huh?
No, other than just thank you so much. I've had so much fun having you on these last 2 weeks. You, of course, are invited back, but I'm not gonna ask you live on the internet to come a third week in a row. We'll just see if we can make that happen someday.
Sounds good.
Yeah. So thanks again. You can find both of us on Twitter at our little Twitter handles down there. Nirmal, Docker Captain, you can find him there and then reach out to him on Twitter. I think that's that's your main public access point.
That's me on the internet.
Yeah. And thank you all for being here. Thank you so much again. Thanks to my patrons who support this show and the podcast that I promise we're going to get back to. Just know we don't know when the date's going to be. But
we're going to hold you to that, Brett.
I know. Oh, and I'm also editing last week's show because I thought it was really great, and I'm going to condense it down. And so the plan is to re-release that video as a shortened version as well as the podcast off of that. Don't hold me to a date, but that I was working on that all last week, and I'll probably work on it later. So 2023, you will hear the episode from 2021. It'll be all good, and it'll still be just as fun.
Well,
we did Code Spaces last week, in case anybody wasn't here. Code Spaces. Copilot. Sorry, another GitHub thing. I need.
Alrighty. Thank you for having me on your show, Brett. It was awesome. One last parting thought.
Yes.
Because we talked a lot about like trusting compute, trusting packages, package managers.
Yeah.
I pasted in the chat a link to a seminal paper called On Trusting Trust. It's from, I think it's from, when was that? Trusting Trust. 1984 by Ken Thompson. Please read that paper. That will answer your questions about what one can trust in terms of computing. Eventually, you're going to have to trust something, is the gist of it.
Right.
Because unless you're like, a person that can go all the way from designing a chip to programming like an npm library and know like every little bit of that, and know that when it was manufactured it was up to whatever your spec is and you can test that. Not like, very few people like that exist on the planet, and eventually you're going to have to trust something. And so like anything else, it's all that. So that's my last parting
gift
white paper, I guess.
Gift to the show.
Gift is to read that. And thank you again, Bret. And we'll see about me coming on again soon. We'll talk.
Yeah. And
thank you all for the questions. Thanks for listening.
We could talk forever. Everyone. So we could have 5 shows in a day and still have more to talk about. So thanks y'all for joining. I'll be back here next week again live, maybe with a guest, maybe not. And again, thanks to the patrons. We'll see you back on the internet next week. Ciao.